Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Dr. Michelle Maloney. I'm our co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. And in a moment, I'll bring up some slides to do an introduction to our Exploring Bioregionalism seminar. And today I'm delighted to bring Sam Wearne into our online community of webinars, and we'll chat to Sam in just a moment. He's done some really fantastic research and a lot of work that connects in and out of bioregionalism, and I think what he has to share will be really fantastic for those of us who are into this space. So firstly, yes, that's our slide. So in today's webinar, we've scheduled about 90 minutes. We'll see if we need all of that time. Hopefully, if we have lots of good discussions, we'll go to the full time. I'm going to give a short introduction to why AELA and myself personally, why we're interested in bioregionalism, bioregioning, and then we'll hand over to Sam for a longer presentation about his research, some of his findings, and then we'll have a good old discussion. Before I go into my talk, I'd like to acknowledge country, and I would invite all of you, as we often have, a bit of an online tradition, to pop into the chat where you are and whose country you're on. So I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the very beautiful lands of the Kabi Kabi peoples. And where I live in Narangba, this is the landscape that speaks to me. This is what I can see when I tootle about in my world, not quite so close, but these are, the European name is the Glasshouse Mountains. And this is a landscape that reminds us of our obligation to each other and to country. If you've ever wanted to look up the story for the Glasshouse Mountains in southeast Queensland, please do. It's a very powerful area and songline. But I'd like to acknowledge the lands were never ceded. It always was and always will be Kabi Kabi country. And also where I live up to the west connects with Jinnaburra traditional lands. I'd like to welcome any Indigenous people joining us today and really honour and respect the ongoing legacy and traditions of caring for country and caring for kin. And as I'll say in my opening remarks in just a moment, for me personally, as a person who lives on this continent, someone who is a descendant of Irish people brought to the colonies by the British Empire, I'm personally really, I think, quite passionate about whether you call it decolonisation or moving to a more truthful way of being together on this continent. And I also feel that the Western notion of bioregionalism or bioregioning is a bridging concept that can help Westerners like myself connect with what Aboriginal people have had since time immemorial, which is that deep connection to unique places. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So it is with great respect that I acknowledge the country that I live, work and play on. And I hope that you can reflect on where you live or where you are today, whose country it is, and maybe think about the plants and the animals that make you happy and make you smile. So for those who don't know, on the modern map of Australia, I'm just a bit north of Brisbane, but this is also where I am in the Aboriginal map of Australia, which isn't entirely accurate, but as Indigenous elders like Mary Graham and others say, it's a wonderful map, not just showing places, but showing the governance and these ancient connections that continue today. So a quick advert. We started our bioregionalism series a little while ago, just a couple of months ago. Our next one coming down the pipeline is a yarn on the 24th of October with the always wonderful Ian Lowe, and we'll be exploring Western scientific perspectives of bioregions and boundaries. And then next year, or possibly even in December, we'll be starting longer and deeper conversations with a lot of our Indigenous friends, including Mary Graham, Ross Williams and Anne Polina. So when we put all of our webinars together in, say, 12 months, we're going to have a really wonderful, diverse collection of ideas about all of these different issues. And for those who might have missed them or wanted to watch them again, the two webinars we've already had a really fantastic session with Shrishti, who works with a number of different groups in India. The recordings are on our website. And the most recent one was a fascinating discussion with two remarkable women about bioregionalism, localization and housing. So on with the show. If I just wanted to mention a little bit about AELA. It's always an opportunity to share with you who we are. We're a small not-for-profit organisation created about 10 or 11 years ago. And really we're fascinated by and passionate about earth-centered governance? How do we build societies that are ecologically healthy and socially just? And how do we change the way the current Western paradigm in particular, but industrialized societies more generally, treat the living world? We're interested in governance. I don't want to nerd out on the governance stuff, but just want to remind people that if you've never seen AELA folks out planting trees, we actually do that in our spare time. But what we do through our work as an NGO is get people thinking about the rules that we make to live, work, and play together, not just the laws, how we interact as human beings together, and how all of that is embedded and is built up from our culture and our values and beliefs. And a lot of the work we do is helping people unpack and understand some of that and think about where we're going. So the bioregionalism series itself is because we're interested in bioregionalism loosely as a philosophy. And one of the reasons I'm so pleased that Sam agreed to come on the session is he's done some great research into the changing and emerging ideas about what this concept did mean, does mean, could mean. We don't want to be ideological or one way fits all. But some people have referred to bioregionalism as localization within the foundations of nature. It's a simplistic overview, but it's one way of thinking about it. AELA is interested in bioregionalism for a number of reasons. Firstly, as I said before, it's a Western construct, but sometimes it can be useful to remind people that prior to 1400, most of this planet was a patchwork quilt of what you could call bioregional governance. And in some of our other sessions, we show a series of maps that show all of the different tribal groups and customary boundaries of territories and places around this planet before European colonization changed a lot of the map of the world. And most importantly, if it triggers people to think more deeply about the human nature connections, then that's terrific. All right, think I'll just end it there. I did just want to give a plug for Greenprints. It's one of our programs, but it is the one that is really looking at how we can live within our limits and using bioregional or catchment or other ecosystem boundaries to help us understand what's possible and what is nature telling us to do to live in a more sustainable way. The question we like to throw around, particularly to Westerners, is, okay, if everyone woke up tomorrow and everyone agreed we had to live within our limits, how would we do it? Because for 500 years, our dominant systems have said, if you run out of stuff, you can go next door and steal it from them. So, how do we live here forever? It's a good question. But without further ado, I am delighted to introduce Sam. Hello, Sam. How are you today?
Hello, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon now. I'm very good. It's nice to see some familiar faces here and some new faces too.
Yeah, that's great. And Sam and I met many, many years ago when he was still completing his PhD. So it's really wonderful to be able to share his research with you all. So enough from me. Sam will probably have a yarn for about half an hour, and then we'll come in with some questions. So again, if you've got any questions for myself or Sam, or you just want to throw some questions out there for discussion, please write them in the chat and we'll collect them. So thank you, Sam.
Thank you. So I'll just get my screen set up.
That's a beautiful image of giant kelp, I imagine. Yes?
Yes, correct. So can you see my first slide here?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Well, it's wonderful to have the chance to reconnect with Michelle and AELA and to give a bit of a presentation on some of the work that I did during my PhD, as Michelle has introduced. So I'm going to cover a fair bit of territory in this presentation. I probably crammed too much in, but it's because I want to kind of give you the breadth and a bit of depth. So it might be overwhelming, but if you've got questions or you've got particular bits that are interesting to you, throw them in the chat. I probably won't be able to see them, but I'll give Michelle a bit of a handle on what we might talk about after the presentation. So as Michelle introduced, I want to talk about bioregionalism and a range of different concepts that it captures, and acknowledge that, this is 50 years old almost now as a Western concept, and it has many different histories and many different expressions across the world. And so I want to talk about how it's kind of being engaged, being reinvented and being reinvigorated in the current day, which is why I got interested in it. But before I do, I want to also talk about, and Michelle's given a wonderful introduction here, that we're going to be talking about context and place and I'm in Australia. I assume a lot of the people calling in are in Australia. So I also want to acknowledge country and pay my respects to the Gadigal people whose lands I'm dialing in from. And because we're going to talk about a lot of different contexts, some of the ideas about belonging and connection to place are a bit abstract and theoretical. So I really do encourage you, as you're listening to them, to think about what do they mean for you and your context. Some of them might land with you and some of them might feel completely inappropriate or foreign. And that's one of the tensions that I think comes up when you engage with this discourse like bioregionalism. All right. You can use the chat, but I'm always curious to find out why people are here. What is it about bioregionalism or bioregions or bioregioning that resonates with you? What makes you want to be here and be a part of it? And so that might be sharing, what do you think that those terms mean? What is a bioregion in your definition? And what does bioregionalism mean to you? There's no rewards for this. You can eat your lunch as a reward, but there's also no test. So as Michelle has introduced there's a kind of a general sense, and then there's different emphases that people have put on this over time. So the definition on the screen here is related to a bioregion, and this is from a very famous essay called Re-inhabiting California by Peter Berg and Raymond Dasman. And they talk about these two kind of elements. They talk about this geographical element. So a geographical terrain, this is kind of the ecological, geological, and kind of the biological expression of nature in the landscape. They also talk about this terrain of consciousness, which is kind of the places that we know, how do we see patterns in the landscape as humans? And those two ways of thinking about a bioregion can seem really straightforward on the surface, but they also can be an entry point for a lot of debates about at what scale the bioregions occur, where should we draw the boundaries, and a lot of kind of experience in discussing this in many places over time. So I'm not going to try and give you a whole range of like solid definitions. I'm going to use this as fuzzy concepts and show how these emphasis is fluid and changes depending on who's speaking and the kind of politics that they bring into it. So bioregions is a key concept. And then bioregionalism is more of a social movement and an eco-philosophy. And that's about how do you learn to live within your bioregion. So there's an element here about knowing where you are, being conscious of that and loving it, wanting to care for it, and then some ideas about how we can do that. So the roots of bioregionalism in the US can be traced back to ideas in the 1930s about regionalism, about 1950s conservation science, and the DIY, grassroots, and back to the land kind of movement in the 70s. Again, 50 years of history, there's a lot of different interpretations and redefinitions that come up. So Cascadia is this like kind of classic point of discussion in the US. There's a bioregion in the Northwest here, which a lot of these US thinkers engaged with. And the text on this is too small, but it's trying to do both those geographic kind of, biophysical descriptions, but also make it meaningful, make it emotive, try and describe the aesthetics of this landscape and create an identity around it. And you can see in the US that there's other elements of the politics of bioregionalism that come up. So yes, it's about having a consciousness of this scale of landscape, and appreciation of its ecological heritage and form, and trying to make a case of how we might live here. So there are links in here to a political and economic agenda in some bioregional discourse, which is about we should be governing in these units. So our governance systems should be regional. Our economics systems should be decentralized, and we should have mostly eco-local patterns of economy as much as they can. So this kind of self-sufficient eco-locales. So it's an element about thinking of how we can live well in nature, thinking about the future, and there's a lot of kind of politics that come into this. The second point here is that in most of the Western world, there's a big disconnect in where we live, and this kind of idea that we live in bioregions isn't the way most of us live our life, and a lot of people don't know much about where we are. So one of the tools that was very popular in bioregionalism is this "Where are you at?" quiz. It's pretty interesting to do yourself, I think. And you can see here that there's, it asks a bunch of different questions about where you are. Do you know, the catchment or the watershed, as they say in the US, of where you are? Do you know the geology? Do you know some of the local and native plants there? Do you know the historical context of where you are? Do you know how dependent or not related your patterns of food, waste, and energy are in this area? And so you can see that there's kind of a way to foster an awareness of this scale. There's another tool that is often used, which is about mapping, so drawing maps, seeing what you know about where you are and the patterns of the biophysical patterns that relate to it, and also then thinking about, well, what are the human patterns of living here, and where are their problems, and what might we do better in the future? This kind of call to action on the left here, you can't really change what you do until you change your idea of who you are. And in Peter Berg's view, and your idea of who you are should stem from the place where you are. So this kind of call to have, really strong regional place-based identities. Again, as I said, there are different emphases in different parts of the world when we talk about bioregions, and that's a term. So I'm talking about bioregions here. And I think it's interesting to know, and I had to go back to some of Peter Berg's original writing. Bioregions was actually a term before he used it. So he reinvented that. And it had more of a biophysical meaning. And so in Australia, I think when a lot of people talk about bioregions, they tend toward this, not the terrain of consciousness, but the terrain of geography, like these units of biophysical patterns in the landscape. And we codified this in Australia. So, here's the interim biogeographic regionalisation of Australia, and you can think about the 89 bioregions that are present in kind of formal documents in Australia. And there's a whole bunch of really interesting ways that people came up with these identification of different bioregions in Australia. And it's also a whole bunch of resources that you can read if you actually want to learn about where you are, which is good. So again, different histories of these terms and a different emphasis here. As Michelle also mentioned, a lot of the interest in bioregionalism is inspired by, ancient ways of living in humanity. And Australia, if we're sitting in Australia and we're thinking about this, I think it's very important to remember that context because, these ideas aren't new ideas from the US that are talking about, these patterns of civilization. And they knew that they were new ideas. And so some of the more problematic elements of bioregionalism is its engagement with Indigenous concepts of place and some of the politics about belonging. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And I like to think about these terms generously. We don't know what was the intention of different people when they come into these spaces, but it's always good to be critical and think about, well, what are the politics that you want to bring in? And I think in Australia, there's a lot of the context of colonization makes the questions of belonging and relationships to place, they should be very forefront in our mind. And so some of the language of bioregionalism in the past and bioregional thought has talked about becoming native. And I might get into that a little bit later, but you can see immediately that's an uncomfortable kind of term. And it can be an invitation for, non-Indigenous people to feel really connected to where they live, but it can disconnect the politics of that connection from questions of decolonisation and questions of, the social and ethical aspects of belonging to a place, which has really challenging histories and unresolved histories of who belongs there and who doesn't. So these tendencies, we wrote a paper on this. If you want to kind of dive into it a bit more, we talked about them as a biophysical tendency, which puts this emphasis on the biophysical regions. And that can be really good to harness our love for nature and to support a kind of ecological literacy about the ecological heritage of an area. And it can, generate this drive towards restoration of landscapes. That tendency has also been critiqued over the last 50 years in its different expressions. One of the critiques here is that it can be a bit deterministic about nature-culture relations, and that can lead into some problematic and well-worn paths about who belongs where, and this kind of idea of, nature and culture are really tightly connected, and that can lead into politics of exclusion and a bit of an anti-cosmopolitan bent on the way we approach who is welcome. As I mentioned, some of these tendencies were very prominent earlier, and they have some narratives about becoming native and a lot of engagement with Indigenous context that can kind of appropriate ideas into Western power structures. And unfortunately, then this kind of movement of bioregionalism can be a colonial movement, and it can be a kind of a way of naturalizing settler claims to place and kind of erasing Indigenous perspectives and politics from the future. So it can kind of be a very settler-oriented view of the future. Critical tendency is a term like critical bioregionalism, and it kind of tried to respond to some of the problems or critiques that emerged around early bioregional thought. And one of those was that if you foster a really strong love for your home place, but we live in cities and we have these material footprints to our lives, that we can kind of ignore the shadow places. So Val Plumwood, an Australian philosopher, talked about shadow places. And she kind of called us to think more about the places that grow you. So it actually dissolves the kind of biophysical focus and says, let's think about all the places in the world that underpin our existence. So it can end up with a much more kind of material supply chain, environmental footprint type politics of sustainability, which somewhat ironically can end up losing the materiality of nature, the materiality of place that bioregionalism came to kind of assert. And so you can end up with this kind of lifestyle environmental movement that ignores this kind of connection to place and connection to nature, which is important. So building on these, and I think this is the most present wave that we see in inspiring people and generating some interest, is this kind of processual tendency. And it thinks about all of those critiques. It faces into the problems that I've talked about there, but also accepts that there's something compelling here. You know, we do live in a globalized world, and we do want to connect with where we live, and we want to be productive citizens in those spaces. And so the emphasis here is moving away from this ism, which can be a bit kind of static and a bit doctrinal about what thou must do to be a good bioregional citizen, into accepting that these are ongoing, very contextual and emergent discussions. And so this is an ongoing kind of action that people can do to learn where they are, to have discussions about what's appropriate here and what kind of future we want together. And so we wanted to, with my wonderful colleagues here, we wanted to understand a bit more about the history, which led us to do some of the research I very briefly talked about there. But we also wanted to understand, well, what is the state of bioregionalism today? So what are the kind of emerging emphases and tensions and hopes and challenges that people who are engaged with this movement or these ideas are facing in their work? And so I was fortunate to connect with some leading thinkers in this space through my PhD. And through that, we drew together a whole bunch of people like me who were curious about these terms. You know, I wasn't around in the 70s to be engaging with the original thinkers, but I saw these terms coming up. And for me, I was doing a PhD looking at place-based discourses in sustainability. So there's many different versions of sustainability, and there seems to be a invigoration about the role of place in what we can do. And I wanted to understand the role of scale, and I thought the bioregional perspectives on scale is really interesting. It separates it from a lot of other place-based perspectives. Anyway, there was other people that were also interested in it. We decided we're going to do some research together. So 3 of us have actually now finished our PhD, hurrah. And this was like a 1-year project, and it was very interesting. And I might talk a little bit about the process of learning when you're talking about contextual sustainability with people from very different contexts. It added a whole nother kind of interesting level of learning and a whole part of the problem, I think, that we face in these kind of global discourses that I can get to later. So we wanted to find out a bit more about this idea of bioregioning. What does this contemporary bioregional thought and practice look like? What does it involve? What's attracting to people to it? What are some tensions and challenges that people are facing? What do we feel about it as people who are kind of new to this? And how is this being interpreted across the world by people doing it? So we started off by kind of coming together, and we, had some Zoom calls during COVID, and we kind of mapped out, well, what do we think? Like those two questions I asked you, what do we think bioregions are? What does bioregionalism mean to us? And we quickly realized that these concepts hid a whole range of definitions and emphases that we didn't realize at the start. So coming from Australia, I kind of had the IBRA, 89 bioregion in Australia, that's obvious perspective. And then I met other people who were very much bioregional. Bioregions can exist at any scale. They can be your backyard to, Cascadia. And so we started having these interesting debates or, discussions to try and unpick, well, what is it that we're actually talking about? And what is it that draws us together? Is there something unique here, or is this just kind of word salad? We felt that there was. And we also saw that when we mapped it out, it looked to be that there were some key influences that were kind of shaping our different perspectives on this. And so we tested that with some kind of fancy Google search to make sure that they were kind of prominent voices in contemporary bioregional thought and practice. And then we sort them out and we interviewed them. And then we use this process called reflexive thematic analysis. And so that's, just accepting that, we're not just going to take what people say, we're also parties to what we hear. And so we're going to be reflexive in those interviews, and we're going to think about what the meanings are that are generated from our relationship to the things that people say. So these names might be familiar to some of you. If they're not, I encourage you to kind of read their work if it's interesting. So Joe Brewer is based in Colombia at the moment. He's written a great book called The Design Pathway for Regenerating Earth. And he does some work in Barranquilla, Colombia, looking at kind of creating bioregional movements to regenerate landscape. And he's interested in networks of bioregional kind of communities across the world as well. Isabel Carlisle is based in the UK. And so there's a bioregional learning centre in Devon that she heads up. And they've done work around kind of local rivers, like the Voice of Dart. They've done looked at the kind of the donut economics, which a lot of you I'm sure are familiar with, looking at a Devon donut. So kind of localizing questions of aspirations and boundaries of how they might live well there. Daniel Christian Wall has written a great book called Designing Regenerative Cultures that some of you may have read. He's really interested in the kind of theory of bioregional change, and has written really interesting things I find on scale. So where does bioregional kind of change fit in different approaches to regeneration and sustainability? Michelle Maloney, who you all know and love. And Glenn Page, who's based in the US in the Gulf of Maine. And so Glenn does, I've engaged with Glenn through his work on learning journeys. So he does some work with different communities of bioregional movements around the world. And he runs these kind of learning journeys to go into a bioregion and understand where you are. And he personally does it in the Gulf of Maine. But he's also worked with Tayside in Scotland. And John Thakrar, who is at the Royal College of Art. He's a writer, and he is the person who actually kind of, we found first introduced this term bioregioning and this kind of shift toward the process of creating or doing the work of bioregioning. All right. So very quickly, I'm going to kind of talk about what we found, and I hope this is remaining consumable because we've covered a bit of territory already. Good. Thumbs up from Michelle. So similarities. I'll start with similarities, then I'll talk about some differences. And you'll probably see some themes of connection, understandably, to the history of the terms that I just talked about. So first of all, why are people seem to be interested in bioregional thought? We referred to these as kind of pathways to bioregional thought. It seems to attract people because it offers some systematic approaches to global challenges. So there's some kind of, there's a stream here of systems thinking and strategic action in contemporary interest in bioregionalism. Then there's that really emotive connecting to nature and relating to where you live. There's this context of global environmental issues, which I think relates to all of this, right? So a concern with global issues, but this kind of need to feel useful. And so when we talk about climate change, a big problem often is that it's an abstract, global, far off kind of thing until you localize it and make it real for people where they live. And you can generate a lot of agency if you can make a compelling case for why your area matters. And for some people, that regional scale is a really useful link to show that, to say, well, this regional scale has a big footprint in the global scheme of things. And it's also close enough to where you live, where you're a real agent here, and you can make a difference. And then it's also this kind of rationalization of how we should structure our system. So this question of the way we currently live and the impacts that it has. Some of the strategies and practices in terms of what people are doing. You can see it happening on different scales. So you can see some people are interested in building a kind of global movement around bioregionalism and creating regional networks to localize that work. Other people are really interested in practical on the ground work, creating local networks and communities and working out what they want to do here. And some people are interested in more of the biophysical restoration. Other people are more interested in the cultural and emotional relationships to the landscape and creating that resonance with an awareness of where people are. We summarize these into 3 motivators, and it reiterates what I've just talked about. So why are bioregions useful? What do these terms carry? And I think bioregions is a key term here. So in the one sense, they foreground nature and they let us have an imaginary or a vision for the future where humans and non-humans thrive in shared and locally resonant landscapes. The bioregions also are containers. They help us disaggregate a really large and complex world. And so you can start to imagine this interconnected patchwork of bioregions, and that helps people grasp what a future economy, what a future kind of contemporary and cosmopolitan way of living might be. And they inspire agency. So they justify this focus on local landscapes and they encourage local people to do things. It invites you that this is not like, the realm of experts and orders that come on from a high. This is actually something that requires all of us to change the way we live. And there's a lot of room for involvement. Whoop, there we go. Now, as people are pursuing these, as we've found throughout the kind of history of bioregionalism, there are tensions in this. And so even today, we heard people talk about that when you're trying to pursue and promote these strong connections to place, this can be a fodder for narratives of exclusion. And so there was some concern that, that this kind of xenophobia or this kind of, this authoritarian reflex that we're seeing in a lot of democracies where there's a tendency to want to be more insular, to kind of push back against migration and to, claim spaces for locals, can be tied up in this love for nature and this love for place. And so the politics of belonging are really interesting and complicated, and they can bring out the best in us and they can bring out the nasty side of us too. And so that's one, pretty important tension that people find they're facing. The second one is that the abstract ideas and concepts of bioregions and this kind of idea of scale and systems change can be really compelling, but it can also be really distracting. And so again, people can get really lost in the debate about boundaries. Should we be talking about catchments, or should this be Australian bioregional models, or should this be something else? You can get lost in the debate about what the topic is before you actually start going to do some important work. There's also an element here about scale. And I think this is really interesting in that when you have a dialogue that assumes that this is a global movement, it can take a lot of work to have conversations across contexts. And for us, it took us a year to really understand what the hell we're all talking about and why we had different opinions on things. And that sounds flippant, but it's you have to go through it to kind of appreciate it, I think. the politics of living in a colonized country are really obvious to us. They're not really obvious to people who don't live in that context. And so I'll talk about in a minute how it seems that context shapes priorities a little bit in the interviews and the work that we've done. There's also a power dynamic there. So, there's this kind of, if bioregionalism is a global abstract theory, that starts to create a power dynamic of whose ideas are right and where they come from. So does this come from textbooks, or does this come from the ideas that are generated around a kitchen table or around a conversation by a bunch of local people thinking about what's important to them? There's a kind of practical tensions when you're pursuing this work too. So the reality is that a lot of the world lives in cities, and we can do a lot of what makes our local area to feel more attractive and to be more sustainable. But at what point should we also pay attention to the supply chains that sit behind our local lives? And so that's that ongoing kind of critique and critical bioregionalism. And then there's this very practical challenge of a lot of this work's really good and it's really important, but a lot of people doing it raise questions about how's it funded? So who has the energy, time, and resources to do this work? And if we're talking about empowering local people, how are we actually giving them the knowledge and the decision-making power to do some of these changes? So really kind of practical questions and it's attention about trying to do this work. I've talked about some of these tensions here a bit already. So I might just skip to the last one here to talk about something that we noticed here as an entry point in the present day is that there seems to be a different perspective in people who engage in these conversations about what the problem is, and the way we frame that problem then seems to rationalize different answers. And I'll talk about that more as I get into the differences. So I have some notes and I'll read those because so one of the things that we found when we talked to people is that there was a lot of similarities and then there was very nuanced differences. So everyone we talked to talked about the importance of ecological literacy, for example, but there were differences about what ecological stewardship looks like in the context of global change. So again, I'll talk about this in a minute, but if the challenge is restoration, then ecological stewardship looks a different way. If we think the Holocene is over and this is about hardcore rapid adaptation to climate change, then stewardship looks very different. And the kind of rational priorities that you unlock from that starting point are very different. Everyone kind of is attracted to this rational, structured, and strategic approach to action, but they're different priorities, again, if you're interested in facilitating global networks or if you're interested in pursuing locally emergent responses. And there's a tension there. If you're trying to create local coherence and agreement versus global coherence and agreement is different to trying to create locally specific responses. One creates diversity, one kind of blends them together. Everyone's committed and attracted to personally and locally resonant ways to experience emancipatory and deliberate change, but there's different levels of concern about the unsavory bedfellows that can be part of this. So there's different levels of awareness and engagement with this, the risk of ethno-nationalism and exclusion that, narratives in bioregionalism can play a part in. And there's also different levels of concern about whether the term bioregionalism is even useful. Is this just distracting? Is the theory of this kind of change useful or is it distracting? And this question of power, is engaging in this as a shared kind of project enabling the politics of power over, or is it enabling a kind of an emancipatory politics of the power to for people? So to get into some of those a little bit more deeply, this is the way we frame it in the paper. We talk about this kind of spectrum of views about how people view the present, from seeing the challenges, one of restoring the Holocene versus, surviving climate collapse. And that, as I mentioned, that tends to rationalize different responses, from a really localized connection to the ecological heritage of a place and restoring that landscape, through to thinking really strategically about how we're going to create enclaves of kind of, new models for governance that can survive the rapid disruptions of a climate collapse. Very different kind of what. Like the how of what people are doing can differ quite dramatically. And then in the middle, which of course is where a lot of people are, is accepting that, ecological and climate systems are changing, and that the world, we're not aiming to create these isolated local enclaves. We want a cosmopolitan world, and we need to work within the confines of cities. And so there's this kind of subtle dancing with the system, referencing Donella Meadows there, understanding the kind of the challenges and continually kind of probing what's possible. One thing I mentioned is that this contextual dynamic, and when you look at where people are from, and in our own conversations, we did notice that whenever you answer these questions, you usually have to contextualize your answer with what you've experienced and where you are. And that seems to me to be suggesting that bioregioning is plural. And that's the whole idea of it, is that it does, whenever you localize the ethos of what we're trying to achieve, it completely changes depending on the context of where you are, the challenges, and the kind of, the work that needs to be done there. And so there is this kind of patterning and shared perspective that seems to happen across geographies. But there's also value in the conversations that happen when we connect with people from other contexts. And so, yes, it's personally and contextual influenced, and there is this kind of re-emerging global interest and discussion about it. And so Planet Drum was founded by Peter Berg and his colleagues. And there's re-emergence of some of these ideas and interests of, a network of global bioregional learning centers, and discussions around the world about what we might do. And I find those useful, less so in generating a universal theory of change than it is to sharpen your critical reflexivity. Having a conversation in a different context helps you work out why you might agree with them and where you might not. And that by sharpening that, you can be more reflexive and critical about what it is that you care about and what's important. So what? A quick recap. I think one of the things that we were left with after this, one of the things I find interesting, and I came at this from the context of a PhD, so I'm interested in the role of research in social change and the knowledge that we can generate through research. And so I found it really interesting that in this discourse of bioregionalism, there is a relational dynamic to knowledge. So where we are influences what we know, and that's really interesting. And you can extrapolate on that if you're interested. I can talk a little bit more about it, about the politics of sustainability and what researchers' role is in change. Connected to that is this idea that context really matters. You can think you're talking about clear-cut definitional kind of terms, but the more I find you engage with people and pick it apart, you realize a lot of them are boundary concepts, and we bring different understandings of those terms when we come to discuss. And again, so those boundary concepts are actually really useful if you want it to be a deliberative approach and you want the value of different perspectives to tease out pros, cons, and dilemmas that you're engaging with. I might leave it at that. I've talked about the different motivators here, from the global priorities through to kind of local context. And again, I've also talked about the value that I think this latest iteration, this bioregioning term, harnesses when it accepts that there is no playbook, but a bunch of conversations and explorations that need to be done in the context of wherever you are. So I'll leave it at that, Michelle, and then maybe we can have a bit of a chat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sam. I've read your papers, but it was really fantastic hearing you give that overview. So I've got a couple of issues I'd love for us to talk about first. There have been some lovely comments in the chat, and there's one or two questions which I will get to. And folks, if you do have any other questions that occur to you in the next 20 minutes, please jot them in there and I'll try to make sure I get to all of them. So Sam, let's go back a little bit into I've got questions about reflecting on the origins of bioregionalism. And before we then jet forward back into our current year or century, let's talk a little bit about some of the biases and the knowledge and perhaps the politics of the early US use of bioregionalism. And perhaps before I ask you to comment, could you also include in your reflections, in the early readings I did on bioregionalism, there was a very strong emphasis on the arts and creativity and literature. And on the one hand, when I was reading it as an Australian, a non-Indigenous settler Australian descendant, I could see the absolute beauty of these Westerners really trying to connect deeply with their place through creativity. Yeah, I also found some of it, including the going native and these other ideas. I mean, maybe it's because of the time, maybe because of the people. And I will talk, if it's okay, a little bit later about the colonial and decolonizing ideas connected to bioregionalism. So I'll come back to that. Let's talk a little bit about the origins of the early concepts, and what's problematic and perhaps what's good about some of that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the sentiment of everything everything you've just said, and
we're in violent agreement. That's great.
Yeah. So, how can I start? So I think the emphasis is there's always an emphasis on like kind of supporting scientific knowledge of where you are. So there is that element of, what's the flow of water, what's the soil chemistry, this kind of biophysical literacy of where you are and the heritage of that place. And then there's a different set of work and different bunch of activities that those early thinkers did on trying to make that people love where they are, and also try and make these kind of units like Cascadia resonant. To place meaning. We can attach meanings to places in lots of different ways, and the power of stories and art and the way we story place and our relationship to it helps us to create those identities, and it emphasizes some elements over others. And so I think that it was a deliberate engagement with that kind of process, which is fair enough, and I think it's really valuable. As you say, it can also be uncomfortable, and I think this is this often happens when you read when you decontextualize writings from the person, and you read it in a different era and from a different setting. But yeah, some of the language is uncomfortable for me, and some of the processes of the way Indigenous concepts were engaged with, it's extractive. It can feel a little bit like, oh, there's good knowledge in here, let's take it and use it, and then we'll use that to empower my idea of the future. And I might even read to you, Jacob Weeb writes really well on this. What did he write? He said, the problems of this narrative and this appropriation, he talks about Indigenous people provide the paradigm for local adaptation, but are relegated to forerunners rather than contemporary agents, thereby leaving it up to current possessors of the land to reinstitute their paradigm. And so there's this kind of, always referring to Indigenous cultures as the past, in the past tense. It's really disrespectful, and I think it also lacks imagination. It's like, so yeah, reading this, some of those ideas from Australia, the process doesn't feel right, the politics doesn't feel so right, and I think we can do a lot better. And as a white non-Indigenous Australian, there's also questions of like, what's your role? And if we want to inhabit places ethically, part of that is really thinking about the ethics of belonging and the heritage of where we are. And there might not be easy answers to that, but there's clear questions that should be prioritized in the work that we do. So again, that's different politics. And I think the risk of this, what I find interesting, and the risk of some of these narratives, is that there's always a claim to place. Simone Weil, a great philosopher I really like, and I engaged with her work at the start of my PhD. She wrote the the most fundamental and least recognized need of the human soul is a connection to place. And I think that's true. And I think a lot of sustainability and a lot of Australians try and kind of inhabit this cosmopolitan ethos. And so it's easy to kind of kick away, you know, any claims to place, any feelings that you want to belong. And I think that's dangerous too, because we will make those claims and we will harbor those kind of connections. And so we need to challenge that in a way that's positive. So yeah, for me, you can't disconnect the politics of, like, you know, decolonization and sustainable living in place in Australia. I think, how can you disconnect those questions and conversations?
No, thank you, Sam. And sorry, you're going to continue?
I could wrap it on forever. If you wanted me to talk about the politics of knowledge, I think that's really interesting. So for me, when I was looking at where I got to at the end of my PhD, you know, sustainability in my whole career was often a universal and abstract idea. So you would gather best practices from across the world, you would decontextualize what works, and then you would come up with, okay, this is the best practice in this sector or this kind of issue. And then you would localize it again into context. And so it's this very like top-down universalist version of sustainability. There's always been this other lineage in sustainability, which is Matthew McGillivray talks about it like a relentless focus on context. And so it pushes back against this idea that, you know, localizing best practice here is right. Actually, we need nuance. We need contextual nuance. And so what I think is really interesting here is some of this work around bioregional learning centers, but also if you look at, you know, Indigenous cultures and the really contextual nuance that comes out when you just go deeper and deeper and deeper into place. And for me, I think I wrote another paper on this to say, well, what would, you know, research, a baby step, what would scientific contributions to sustainability and governance look like if our publishing system was regional? And so instead of having to decontextualize what you learn from a place and then, you know, talk about it with someone on the other side of the world, what would happen if you just keep that really local? So there's different protocols for doing research here. There's different protocols for who sees, you know, what type of knowledge is valuable. And by reading this paper, you learn more and more, deeper and deeper into what makes sense here, what kind of knowledge is generated specific to this context. Anyway,
that's wonderful, Sam. No, not at all. That actually connects to one of the early ideas we had within Greenprints, which was cornerly called Bioregional TV, which was actually connecting local media students and local people to actually be sharing their knowledge and updates about ecological restoration and environmental issues at the local level. Because as we know, and I'm digressing, but, you know, with the continual either foreign ownership or continual corporatization of media outlets, local communities have lost everything from local newspapers to local news. You know, even when I was a kid, local news included the actual towns and weather. Now it's just your main cities and take a guess at what's going on in your own place. So I think that information creation, and can I just say it links directly to the bigger issue of decolonization. And I would like to come back to it and then put a pin in it, because I know there are other questions and other issues. And look, it's a shameless plug for a course that AELA is running in October called Introduction to Decolonization. I wonder, Sarah, if you get a moment, you could put the link for our course into this. The more and more research and reading I do around the decolonizing and making sure that decolonization isn't colonized, the more and more it speaks to what you're saying, Sam, about the fundamental orientation of Western knowledge seeking is all knowledge is great. Let's just get the best and most innovative thing. So either we can make money out of it or be efficient, and let's throw that down on the local. Whereas if you start to decolonize, you start to see the world differently. So what I'd like to do, Sam, with your permission, I'd actually very much like to show everyone a couple of slides I use in both, like yesterday, Elder Mary Graham, who I'm sure a lot of people know, and Mary and I work together a lot. We're working on a book together, and I want to give two things. One, I just want to show these slides I use to simply remind Westerners what we're talking about when we're trying to roll back the colonization of Western notions of knowledge. But secondly, I do want to speak a little bit later about an amazing real example of what's emerging down in the southern parts of southeast Queensland with Mary Graham and the Yugambeh language speaking groups doing some remarkable governance but also connecting with Greenprints. And so we're starting to find ways for, and this speaks to much of the questions, particularly Matthew, thanks for your questions about, Indigenous boundaries and knowledge systems are unique and remarkable and important and must be privileged in this country. And also, we have 96% of the entire population are non-Indigenous people. And that's why I'm fascinated with the context and the potential of bioregionalism, because, not ism, bioregioning, because here in Australia, there are ways that we can rebirth the local that are really respectful of watching and learning from what Indigenous people are doing in restoring and rebuilding and amplifying their existing governance, and then finding ways for us as non-Indigenous locals to work hand in hand together with proper respect, no one taking ideas from each other, working in partnership. And I'm just so excited about what Mary Graham and the gang down there are doing and what the potential is for the non-Indigenous communities who are starting to coagulate. I don't think people can coagulate, sorry, around some of these ideas. It's really cool. But let me just take a moment. I think some of you will be very familiar with this, but some might actually find it very helpful. This is the story. Bear with me, guys. Okay. I'm now ruined the surprise of my maps. I just want to remind you all in a couple of easy steps what it looks like to decolonize what we think we know. So imagine the world in 1400, the whole planet. This is one interpretation of the tribal boundaries across North America prior to European colonization. This is one interpretation of what people's communities, biocultural, bioregional communities looked like across South America before European colonization. Africa it's a very contested knowledge space, but let's just say this is on the right track. These were established empires and places, and the rest were the grey areas are not indicating there's no people there. They don't have a lot of information about how people organized or where their territories were. But look at Africa, look at South America, look at North America. Now look at Australia. Is there something common going on here? The entire world was a patchwork quilt of people and places, including Europe. This is Europe in 1444. We had the Ottoman Empire, but we had a lot of nations. We had a lot of emerging nation states. Remembering, actually, these are feudal places and empires. The modern nation state came out of the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648. 1648. So even before the 1600s, the nation state wasn't really a thing anywhere. But remember, what happened was when the Europeans started to move into the rest of the world, invade, take, steal, colonize, influence, everything they thought in that one pocket was the right way to think was pushed upon other places. I won't say anything more, but if you just remember that prior to European colonization, the entire world was this beautiful patchwork quilt of, I'm not saying beautiful, everything was better or perfect, I'm not, but it was a patchwork quilt of humanity. And often what bioregionalism is interested in is how do we undo it? How do we undo these? Look at that. That's the British Empire's invasion of everything. And then the Australian settlement was these big straight lines. And as a governance nerd, this is what I'm fascinated with. If bioregionalism is quite frankly a simple and ancient way that people organized themselves and in the Australian context lived relatively sustainably for millennia, and these big straight lines have led us to, mass degradation, maybe there's something in rethinking how we are allowed to organize and how we are allowed to care for country. So I just really wanted to share that because I remember when I first created that series of maps and showed it to a bunch of students, we teach a lot into master's classes, Mary and I. They were very grateful for it. It was the simplest way for them to see what happened to the planet and why some of these ideas Sam's talking about, universalism, the scientific method only seen through narrow eyes, westernization, the concepts of governance and government and all of those things have rolled out across the place. So anyway, very interesting. And thank you, folks, as people sharing reflections and notes in there. So that's all I wanted to say about that. Let's come back to some more questions. So Sam, picking up from the history of the bioregionalism movement and moving more into the 21st century, can you reflect, you gave us a good overview of your methodology for how you and your friends, particularly, I noticed many of them were from the deep north of the planet. So that's fascinating, isn't it? Um, what were some of the examples you guys and girls saw around the world of current bioregioning, or did anything jump out at you, like this community is doing a new thing, or these guys, or was it really a stock take on what it all meant?
Yeah, look, there are a lot of resources out there mapping different initiatives and kind of movements that are happening around the world. I'm probably not the best source to summarize all of those. Our aim was more talking to the different kind of leaders and influential thinkers that we interview. And so I understand a bit of the work that they're doing. Um, and again, like I not knowing the context, me summarizing their work, I think I just wash out all the nuance and end up talking about, helping the same that high level stuff, helping people understand why they are, supporting kind of processes of restoration, such as in Devon that Isabel Carlisle was engaged in. So the UK actually has a bioregional community of practice. And so we talked to them as well. We shared some of our findings and emerging insights back with different practitioners and people as we went. Yeah, so I feel like when on the surface level, what people are doing is often looks quite similar. But then it's once you get into the context of what they're doing, that's when it gets more interesting. But to really do that justice, you need to have time to hear about the history of the place, the history of the kind of politics of the people doing it, and where the emphases are. And which means you also need to understand, like, well, what's not prioritized? Why this and not that? So, yeah, I can share some links to some resources afterwards if you
Please
want to.
do. If you have time now, or just email them to me and we'll forward them to everyone who registered for today's session. And there were a couple of questions about the slides. People would love a copy of your slides. Yes, we do ask speakers to share slides, and the recordings from our webinars are available within a week or two on the AELA and the Greenprints website. So yeah, thanks, Sam. So I'm just going to go now back to some of the questions people have been popping in our chat. Matt asked, and I think I've kind of spoken to this, but he says, I think this is a very important bridge, as Michelle mentioned, and I think he's referring to bioregional and Indigenous perspectives. A lot of people fighting for wilderness back up their love of nature with a Western scientific understanding of what the natural world consists of. And such a perspective need not and is not, in my view, opposed to a more Indigenous connection, but some have argued there are conflicts. So can we integrate or link these two approaches? Sam, my first thought is I would never look at integrating, but certainly linking and connecting in the way that I just mentioned. I like giving local examples because that's a real touchstone for what's possible. And what I see happening at the southern parts of the southeast Queensland with Mary Graham's group, themselves as a group of clans inside their traditional lands, having that authoritative voice and their love of place, absolutely welcoming with open arms conversations with local landholders and the local council to work together to start, really caring for place. So to me, absolutely linking Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways forward locally is a beautiful and many would argue the most appropriate way to go in Australia. But Sam, what are your thoughts, love?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's understanding the kind of the social and ecological heritage of where you are is the first step. And if you just focus on the ecological heritage, I think you're missing something, particularly in Australia, because that can turn into a really deep love of the natural physical landscape. But you need to go a little bit deeper to ask about the ethics. What else is there about belonging here and being a good citizen of this place? And that means you need to acknowledge the social history of the place and, why you might own land there and other people don't. Who has power and whose kind of future is being realized at the expense of other people. And so this kind of question of decision-making power and authority in Australia is a really critical one. And so if you kind of try to blend in, if you try to westernize caring for country as something that everyone can do, and you kind of ignore the relational and kind of cultural protocols that it's based on, then you've kind of missed a whole bunch of the important politics of this. So yeah, so I agree with you. You know, you don't want to try and if you try and blend things, you're just appropriating it and turning it into something that's very comfortable for yourself. So avoid that. And try and do both. You know, you still need to have people to understand and love where they are, and we all want that. And I think that a love for ecology is a great way forward. Matthew Koloff wrote a book called Landscape of Our Hearts that kind of talks about this as an entry point as well. You know, love for nature and a love for place can be an entry point, but you need to keep challenging people about where they are and the politics of being there, so that it goes beyond a kind of shallow, you know, let's start our love for nature here and ignore everything that's happened in the past.
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. We've got a couple more questions. Someone sent me a private note and asked for their name not to be mentioned, and I'm going to read that question because it's wonderful. They say, will trying not to appropriate Indigenous culture stop us all from doing the right thing in our place? So what I'm going to interpret that as is, in Australia, many non-Indigenous people don't even know Indigenous folks, and they don't know how to handle what our governments have created into a very convoluted space. Does that stop them from trying to do the right thing on country? Of course not. I think the short answer is no. Don't feel freaked out by the complexity of our politics. Do what you can. There's a great quote from Angela. She's an American poet. Sorry, I should have remembered it. You know, do the best you can, and when you learn more, do more. So I just want to I really want to say that as a non-Indigenous person who works really closely with a lot of Indigenous mates, they will say with tears in their eyes, we just want you to love this place the way, you know, we did. Just look after it. Yeah, sorry, Sam, I answered that question, but to me, it's really important.
It's a
be
great
honest
answer.
about this.
It's a great answer. And I guess the context of, you know, how I met Michelle and why I became interested in AELA is because when I looked around and I thought, who's doing place-based sustainability in a way that I think is right? I thought AELA, because, you know, AELA and Michelle really navigate these questions with a lot of integrity and, you know, a lot of care and I think the right approach. And so you can kind of complicate things, but if you're trying to be a good human and you care about other people, and it's not about making yourself, you know, it's not about you, it's about others, other species and other people, you're probably starting off in the right spot.
No, thanks, Sam. And look, with great humility, I'm almost embarrassed by your lovely words of praise. And you know, we're all learning every year. Every year we learn more. And I look back on stuff I did and things I wrote 10 years ago, and I cringe with embarrassment. Every year we learn more about how to be a good earthling. So yeah, terrific. All right, we've got time for some more of these questions. I'm actually going to jump to one of Richard Michelle's questions. I really like it. Can we not care for a bioregion in which we are located without belonging to it, or worse, imposing belonging and identity on those born there? It's a bit of a contentious question, but yeah, what do you think, Sam?
That's a really interesting question. So, yes, I think that's a really good point, and that talks to kind of this foray into critical bioregionalism, which is this idea. The concept sounds really good, and you know the idea that we should care for all places is compelling. It's a compelling concept, but do we? Do we actually care for places that we've never been to as much as we care for the place that we love? And if we try to, what kind of politics are we going to bring to that place? And you see this in kind of environmental movements all the time, where it's like, you know, we lock up forests from Indigenous people who've lived there forever, you know, so it's this kind of, you're bringing your politics to a place without really understanding it and perhaps having a right to. So yeah, I think starting at home is a safer space to do it. But yeah, it's not. I don't want to be too flippant because it's not easy. You know, like there are politics that transcend space all the time, and you know we are involved in the governance and impacts that happen in other places. And so, should we be involved in addressing those and engaging with those and improving those? Well, probably yes, we should. But again, coming back to that idea of empowering bottom-up processes might be better than, you know, wanting bottom-up processes for us, but then assuming we can do some top-down kind of, solution for someone else.
Mm.
Let's be.
That's a lovely answer, Sam. And I guess my only comment would be, I don't feel like we should impose anything on people in terms of what they should do to care for country, but I guess comes back to being a good earthling on this continent. Do what you can, where you can, when you can. Some folks might never go out and plant trees, but they might do something else. And you might never feel as deeply connected to a place as someone else, but perhaps do no harm and do the best you can and care where you can. Definitely would be a nice message, I think. Thanks, guys. There's some really lovely questions, so I'll see if I can get through them. Neil has made a comment and then a question. So he says there are three themes to the current global polycrisis: ecological overshoot requiring dramatic degrowth, threats to the human condition involving health and well-being. Oh, sorry, he said three, but there's two. So ecological overshoot and threats to human conditions. He feels that bioregioning seems to be the only structure and process able to adequately address these. But the question is, there will be inevitable dramatic reductions in energy and materials use and throughput. I think it will drive the bioregioning. It will drive what looks like good health in each bioregion. Comments on that? Sorry, I think I've mangled that question a bit,
No,
but
no,
really it's about energy consumption and degrowth too.
Yeah, and I think through these different questions, you can also see like each of us when we come into this call, and I haven't had a chance to look at the comments. I can only do one thing at a time. But when we come into this call, we'll be here for different reasons, and different elements of the problem will be appealing to us. And so it sounds like, if you start from that perspective, you're worried about the global problem and how we're going to address global sustainability issues. And again, bioregionalism does provide a really useful structure in thinking about that across scale and thinking about it in ways that connect kind of emotional connections to nature and place, and that element of change through to questions of economy and material flows and footprints. So this kind of very rational approach to a more emotive approach. So it's a pretty flexible forum to enter, depending on where you're starting from. So, look, I don't know that much about bioregional economics and the kind of opportunities that it brings. I do think that's really interesting. And so for me, I'm inspired by the idea of more regionally circular economies. And I think once you start thinking about bioregions and you think about the future, it can really inspire your imagination to think about, well, what would this area look like at its best into the future? And you can start to develop a lot more kind of nuanced and interesting futures, and the world becomes bigger, and then when you introduce really kind of interesting regions to one another, the value of cross-cultural exchange and trade and all those things become richer as well. So I think there is something in there about, once you go focus on the regional, you can solve a lot of global problems, but also make the world a bit better. Like, it makes it actually better. It doesn't just solve problems. I think it makes it a better world to live in. So, sorry, it's a bit of a butchered answer as well, but those are the things that I think about when I think about the kind of global material footprint and the kind of questions of economy in relation to bioregionalism. For me, it's about imaginaries of the future. And I think regionally circular bioeconomies is something that becomes really interesting if you try to think about that in a futuristic way. Don't, relegate all technology to the bin. There's some really interesting opportunities that we can now do with different forms of manufacturing and different kind of forms of energy production. And there's an opportunity now to do this in a way that's a lot more tangible than I think was in the past.
Thank you, Sam. Very thoughtful answer. And look, I can't resist putting my New Economy Network Australia, my NENA hat on for a moment. And, for 8 years, myself and many others, including folks on this call, have been building a gentle network of folks looking really fundamentally at what a different economic system could look like, or economic systems. And it always comes back to, well, not always, but should, localization and regional economies and what's best for people and places. Everything from our housing seminar recently in the bioregional space, but in the past, our NINA housing weeks have always been about that localized economy, and what kind of housing you build in a desert should be really different to what you build in the Alps. The kinds of local issues that, as you said, Sam, can be really exciting and positive for a future scenario for a place, should be building in local people, local places. So if you're interested, do have a peek at the NINA website. And I'm excited because next year, the New Economy Network Australia Conference, which is a great chance for folks to come together and talk about these issues, will actually be in Brisbane. And as part of the Gold Coast initiative that myself and others are involved in, we'll be holding, for the first time since COVID, a regional symposium on building a new economy for the regions that will be hosting that in Southeast Queensland. So please do watch this space. And I think also there's a lot of work done on the economies of bioregionalism. I just have to dig some up and bring it into the next sort of future seminar series. So thanks very much. All right.
And I might say, Michelle, if you're
Yeah,
interested,
please.
my colleague, one of the colleagues that I worked with on that paper, Ella Hubbard, her whole PhD is looking at bioregional economies. So
Whoop, whoop. She's
look
on
her
my
up.
radar. So she's triply on my radar now, Sam. We'll make that happen. We'll bring you
Yeah,
back
great.
and get Ella in as well. Thank you. Got a lovely question from Michelle. Michelle Smith. Hello, Michelle. I think a lot of people watch television and read novels to live vicariously through other people rather than connecting to their own place and the people and the nature around them. Would you like to comment?
I would like to comment. One of the things that I found really interesting is I grew up in Western Victoria in a town called Warrnambool, which is near Port Fairy. And I don't know if everyone on the call knows Paul Jennings and Around the Twist.
Yeah.
But it was based in Port Fairy. And I always found it so strange in Australia that a lot of the stories and TV shows and movies that I grew up with, they never named the place where it was. And so it was, and I've heard from people who work in television and film that this is kind of an influence of producers. And back in the day, it's actually changed the complete opposite now. But back in the day, they didn't want to name Australian places because it would lose interest from international audiences. And but I found it really interesting that everything we consumed, I could name all these different streets and places in the US because I was surrounded by references to them. And so I had this kind of, when you go to the US and you see these, places that you've read about, it's really interesting. It adds levels of meaning in relationship to those through fictional stories. And I think that's a real mistake, actually. I think it's really interesting to have cultural connections, like cultural artifacts that connect us to the landscape through fictional lenses, through non-fictional lenses. It actually makes the world really interesting. And so, I think it's really positive that now that shift has changed. So in a lot of like Netflix, the rule now, I think, is go local. So the more local you can go, the better, because that's what people actually want to see. They want to see specificity and nuance of a different way of living in the world. And so, I think there's a lot of the interest in bioregionalism and bioregioning, I don't think is narrow. I think it speaks to a much broader shift in people all around the world who want something different. We're all sick of chauvinism and colonization and a lot of stuff we've tried in the last century. And I think a lot of people around the world want something a bit better for the next. So, yeah.
No, that's a great answer. Thank you, Sam. And Michelle, I love the question too, because what you're pointing to is, I guess, there's two things that I'd like to just quickly comment on. The idea of escapism and stories, which I think humans have, it's always said, stories are as old as humanity. We do need that escapism, and we need to be able to make sense of our world through stories. But I do think part of westernization and globalization has done exactly what Sam said, the blanching out of unique voices. Not so much now. I agree with you. I think Netflix and some publication in the publication industry is shifting a little. But 20 years ago, there was this blanching out. I knew, because I used to go to writers' festivals, and you'd hear people from Australia say, oh, if we write something, you're much better off writing it as if it's based in England, because no one wants to buy a story from Australia. I had friends who wrote PhDs with case studies from Australia. No publishers would publish their PhD as a book unless they rewrote it with European and US examples, because that's where the market was. So to me, this is this constant colonization of sort of Europe and North America, not just on Indigenous peoples of this continent, but non-Indigenous peoples. So, Michelle, I don't know what you think. Please feel free to write it in the chat. But part of the older idea of bioregionalism was absolutely celebrating local places, writing about it, doing art about it. And in fact, I've got to admit, I'm sneakily trying to find a way for AELA to host a 2-year project on, celebrating our local bioregions through arts and culture without any money to do that. So I'm working with some artists at the moment going, how do we make this beautiful thing happen when no one can get paid to do it? Anyway, Michelle, I'm passionate about people celebrating their local places. So I hope that sort of answers your question. We're just about out of time. I might just, there's a comment from Kirsten. I don't know if you want to respond to it, Sam, but I'll just read it out. Thank you for the comment, Kirsten. Lynn Kelly's book, The Memory Code, is a fascinating exploration of how knowledge was passed on in pre-literate societies. Given the current potential of the internet, instrument to democratize knowledge, to undermine fundamental social institutions, seems to make sense to have important knowledge passed on only to those who have demonstrated they know how to handle it. This raises questions about different kinds of knowledge and what we need them for. It's a very knowledge-based question, Sam. Sounds like a thing for you, or a comment.
I might have to have some lunch before I before I have an answer for that. Yeah, look, I don't know what I think about that. I definitely need to think about it. I think knowledge is important to share, and I mean, I do my best to express it in a way that I can live with, because there is a question of like the intention of what you think you said can sometimes be heard in a very different way to what what you thought you put out there. So, yeah, I'm not sure about controlling knowledge, because that smacks of power, right? It smacks of kind of elitism, so much as a more widespread ability to be reflexive and kind of considerate in the way that we engage ideas, perhaps. But that's just an off the cuff answer. I need to think about it more.
The thought I just had in response to Kirsten's comment is, I feel that in reality, this is sort of already happening, because a lot of Westerners spend a lot of time in academia or in government, sitting in an office, thinking abstract thoughts about how the world should be. But in fact, the real knowledge is, and I'm not disrespecting that, please don't think that I did a PhD and abstracted myself into oblivion. But what I see when I go out on country with, and I'm watching Aboriginal people work with national parks folks, and I'm seeing land care folks work with private property owners. And, I think in a way, if you get off the internet and occasionally off a written word and actually on country, you'll find that the real knowledge is being shared and transmitted on the ground with people. And that it's almost like a control mechanism that if you really are serious about looking after a place, get out of the books now and then and get out on country, and then you'll find the people who are doing the weeding and doing the planting and saving the creature that just got hit by a car and putting it back in a tree. So the real info is still there and still bubbling through the next generations, I hope, combined, of course, with the written word and the occasional Netflix documentary. But yeah, it's an interesting thought. And I'm grateful to you, Sam, for constantly raising this idea of knowledge, where it comes from, who has it, who's creating it. These are very important decolonizing sorts of questions. So, all right, I'm just scooting through. I think we're just about finished. There are a number of other lovely long comments, which I won't read through. I might end with this one, another great question from Matt. Do we need to take a careful appreciation of what human culture has produced, different ways of being, so that can bioregionalism replace or work with existing traditions like democracy, socialism, or theocracy? It's a fascinating problem. I think it is a fascinating problem. Thank you for that.
That is a fascinating problem. I'm not sure I have the answer for that one either. I guess I'll just tell you where I'm kind of at now in my research interests and work. So on the one hand, a little bit to your last question, Michelle, I think the PhD for me was a way to work out where is research useful, and part of that is to make critiques, to observe what's happening, and then provide some perspective on it and say, this is what it looks like and this is what we might learn from it. And I think that's really important because, as you said, sustainability is a practice. It's inherently contextual. And so as soon as you start to codify it, you're often missing the kind of wisdom of the doing. And that's just in the Western context of sustainability. So there's a whole bunch of important work that needs to sit outside of academia. And once academia touches it, it kind of breaks, it a little bit. For me, what I'm interested in is, after looking at kind of, place-based approaches to sustainability, and looking at where I think it's working really well, I'm also really interested in how do we make democracy work? And so in Australia, I think, we throw democracy out at great risk. And so I'm really interested in how we can engage with it and try and improve it. And that's a whole nother bunch of questions. But how can we have kind of ecologically literate citizens and appropriate decision-making structures so that we can come together and actually make decisions in the forums that matter so that we do good work? There's a whole range of stuff around that, but that's one piece of research, or a stream of research, that I'm interested in now. And then there's other things that I'm interested in doing outside of research, which is, engaging with people, there's a comment there about circular economies and bioregions. I'm interested in doing that kind of work outside of research processes. Yeah.
Well, we'll see you next year at our new economy bioregional gathering down in Southeast Queensland. But thank you. We are out of time, but we're on time. I might just say, Sam, that question from Kerry is a pretty quick answer, I think. So, Sam, you've spoken about circular economy within bioregions. Do you think it's possible to create open loop systems so different bioregions can trade with each other? Short answer is yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. And that's the way to go. But everything goes somewhere. I often joke that the circular economy appeals to the Western mind because we just go round and round and round. But you have to know where things come from and where they go to in the middle of all of that. And that's your place-based work, and that has to connect. So, but look, enough from me. I know I've yabbered a lot in this webinar because I've been busting to have this discussion with Sam. So I would like to say thank you, Sam. This has been absolutely delightful. And I'll definitely get you back next year, and we might invite some of your other co-authors to explore some of these interconnected topics. So folks, if you know how to press the magic buttons that do a little emoji on your screen, or if you want to do a daggy air clap, let's all thank Sam for his time. Yay. Thank you, Sam.
You're
and I
very
want to thank you all. Yeah, thanks, Sam. I want to thank you all for being with us for 90 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed the discussions, obviously, as much as we have. Hope to see you next month when we yarn with Ian Lowe. And I think it would be really terrific to see you all again next year too, when we reconvene with more amazing topics. So, Sam, I'll let you have the final word and say goodbye. But thank you so much for your time.
No worries. Thank you all. Wonderful to be able to share some ideas and thoughts that I've been engaging with, and I hope to see you all in the future. Cheers.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.